particular was a huge Ralph Waldo Emerson fan. And I always come back to this one quote, and I'll see if I can quote it properly. But it's something like the purpose of life is not to be happy. The purpose of life is to be useful, to be honorable, to be compassionate, and to have it made some difference that you have lived and lived well, right? And I love this distinction between not pursuing happiness, which is very ephemeral, but instead thinking about how I can make an impact, whether that's through my career, my community, my family.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of CBS Spotlight. If you're here by mistake, you are in the right place now. I'm Eric Alvarado, and I'm here with my co-host, Mr. Ted Hikes, and we are your friendly guides through this world of insurance and wealth management. And today, ladies and gentlemen, we have a big timer on the show. We are honored and incredibly excited to have the Chief Investment Officer of Kestra. She's a total superstar, Miss Kara Murphy. Kara, welcome.
Thank you so much. You are way too kind. It's great to be here.
All right. Well, let's jump right into it, Kara. I know that you kind of took an unusual path, so to speak, to get where you are today. And we would love just to kind of hear where you started and how you got to where you are today and some of the things that shaped that.
So at the risk of going too far back, I'll mention quickly that I grew up the daughter of two English teachers. So like the dinner table in my house was like a lot of quoting poetry and like jumping up to act out plays, that sort of thing. Like we never talked about finances. Mm-hmm. But like lo and behold, I ended up on Wall Street in what feels like a very happy accident. Right. And then Eric's looking at me like, how did that happen? People don't often end up on Wall Street by accident, but somehow I did. And so those first couple of years, I felt very much like a fish out of water, like, you know, kind of, I never saw myself here. What am I doing here? And there were definitely aspects of it that I liked, but then not far into my career, 9/11 happened. And, you know, when I mentioned that, most everybody, if you were alive during that time, you can remember kind of where you were and how you experienced that event. I happened to be on the 72nd floor of Tower 2 when the plane hit. And you can imagine, right? Very traumatic experience. Went through a lot during that time period. I lost my cousin. I lost colleagues. And New York in general was just this really rough place. And I, like many people in New York and elsewhere at that time, sort of went through this soul searching, right? Like, why am I here? What is the universe trying to tell me? And I think my mom was, you know, sick of hearing me ruminate about this, because I remember being on the phone with her one time and she was like, Kara, like maybe you're doing what you should be, right? I kept thinking that the right answer was that I had to like leave Wall Street and do something else. And she was like, maybe you're right where you should be. And I was like, what? So, but I tried it on for a little while. And the more I sort of like let myself think about it, I was like, oh, I actually really dig what I'm doing, right? I love analyzing things. I love learning about things. I love the puzzle that the market provides. It's like this constantly changing thing that you have to figure out. And it was ironically, so this like traumatic experience allowed me to be more deliberate in my career and allowed me to say like, oh, this is really what I want to do. And it was really with that I got to lean in. And so I'm probably the only person on Wall Street who had a near-death experience make me want to do more on Wall Street. But it did.
That's such a crazy story. I mean, the way you got into the marketplace, I can't even imagine after going from that kind of just unbelievable experience to doing what you are doing today. I mean, how did you make that shift from, I guess, the asset management side to wealth management?
It was more of an evolution really than anything. Because, you know, as I mentioned earlier, I really love that sort of intangible aspect, that intellectual exercise that being an investor presents. But there was a time where I was like, you know, what's this all for? I would get to the end of the day and I was like, oh, cool, I made $5 million in a stock that went up. But other than like a number on a spreadsheet, it didn't mean a whole lot. So as I started working more with financial advisors and their end clients, then it was like, oh, I'm helping this family retire. And I was like, that's really cool. And so so more and more as I've shifted away from asset management more into wealth management, it's about identifying and connecting those investment decisions and how they make real impacts on people's lives. And that has been so wonderful. And I find it incredibly rewarding.
So Kara, I know this big thing that happened obviously made a big shift in your thought process as it relates to your professional life, but oftentimes we'll see that can make an even more profound impact on our personal life. How did those experiences really kind of change the way you approach family, community, and those types of things?
I think it's an important question because for me, it's always been, or I've tried to be very deliberate about being very purposeful in my career, but also making sure that I'm engaged with my family and my community. And I always like numbers of 3, right? And there we have career, family, community. And those are sort of like the 3 legs of my personal stool. And I often go back to this quote that I mentioned that my parents were English teachers, right? And so my mom in particular was a huge Ralph Waldo Emerson fan. And I always come back to this one quote, and I'll see if I can quote it properly. But it's something like the purpose of life is not to be happy. The purpose of life is to be useful, to be honorable, to be compassionate, and to have it made some difference that you have lived and lived well, right? And I love this distinction between not pursuing happiness, which is very ephemeral, but instead thinking about how I can make an impact, whether that's through my career, my community, my family. And I want my kids to live their lives that way too. And it's been this like wonderful sort of trajectory in my career and in my family life where I've been able to at least come closer to that goal, right? Like, I don't know if any of us ever actually achieve that, but it's become this kind of like guiding force as I've grown.
It's great.
I love that. I love that quote.
Isn't it so great?
It's so good. Yeah, it's really perfect.
It's hard for me to read it without like getting teary-eyed.
Yeah. That's a great quote, Karen. I wrote that down. I'm going to start living my life by that mantra as well. I think that's fantastic. No. So as your role as the Chief Investment Officer at Kestra Management, what are some of the key responsibilities that you oversee, I guess, and what do you do that you find most rewarding about your role?
I'll start with that last part first, right? What's most rewarding? Because I was talking about purpose and like sort of understanding what my purpose here has been really important. Because I started here almost 4 years ago. And at the time, Kestra Investment Management was, an idea on a blank sheet of paper. So we really had a great opportunity to be able to create something that we feel like made a difference, right? And so the first thing that we had to do is identify what our purpose was. And in working with financial advisors, listening to them, ultimately, we came up with this idea that we want to help advisors help their clients make good financial decisions and lead good financial lives. And I often, close out my pieces with this idea of invest wisely, live richly, right? And so it's again like that balancing, making sure that your investments are doing what they need to, but that it marries what you want out of your life, right? So that's the overarching purpose. Now, practically speaking, what that means is that we focus in 3 different main areas. One is investment research. We do a lot of writing, speaking, making charts, talking about what's happening in the markets. And there, every day gives us new material, right? It's just like this fascinating area that you can always chew on and sort of come up with interesting themes. The other area that we focus on is actually managing portfolios. So we sort of take all of that research, we work with advisors to understand, what they need for their clients, and then we create portfolios that we think are, multi-manager, risk aware, low cost, transparent, right? Be able to help our advisors lead their clients to good financial outcomes. And then the third piece is working directly with advisors to make sure that we're supporting them in their business. So for instance, we'll have advisors who come to us with particularly tricky client portfolios, and we'll do a deep dive analysis and kind of work with them on how to get them to a better position. But really that partnership with our advisors is a really important part of what we do.
Well, one thing I heard over and over in your previous response was, the level, the approach you take working with your advisors directly and really digging in with them and understanding that relationship between them and their clients. How do you believe the relationship between those financial professionals and their clients are really evolving and changing in today's market?
I think one thing that I see very clearly come out when I work with advisors is the tremendous trust that they've been able to build with their clients. And it's interesting because, in our sort of like fractured world, I feel like trust is becoming a more and more scarce commodity. So I'm always really impressed in these like very deep relationships that our advisors have built with their end clients. And what that also means is that many of those clients end up looking to their advisors for a wide array of advice and expertise in anything financial related. And if you think back to, multiple decades ago, some of us on this call might remember what the business was like decades ago, but it was very transactional oriented, right? Hey, Mr. So-and-so, I have this really cool stock or a muni bond. Are you interested? Yes, cool. Write it down, move on. Right? Like today's relationships between financial advisors and their clients are very different. They're really consultative. Tell me about your kids. Tell me about this family home that you have. Did you want to buy a boat? I remember you talked about that. Do you have life insurance? Right? There are all these different things then that an advisor has to bring to bear to be able to sort of think about a client's whole life. What that also means is that financial advisor has to become the hub for very deep financial expertise. And I think clients will realize that the financial advisor doesn't necessarily themselves have that deep financial expertise in all these different areas, but a client's going to expect that an advisor can find that insurance expert or the investment expert or whatever it might be, estate planning attorney, right? So you have to be able to have this web of relationships to be able to come to be able to serve your client well. And in many ways, that's harder than what it was when they were just pitching stocks 30 years ago.
So you have to have a good team behind you too, it sounds like, right?
For sure. Yeah.
So Kara, that was a great response. And I think from what we're hearing is that you're definitely different from the prototypical chief investment officer that I would imagine, right? I would think of somebody that's reading charts all day and kind of speaks a language that nobody really else speaks. And you do things a little bit differently because you mentioned like you want that information to communicate all the way down to the actual end consumer. So can you tell us a little bit more about that or elaborate more on that?
Yeah, no, don't get me wrong. I can geek out like the best of them and sit in my spreadsheets and my charts. I love that too. And you hinted at this, like, I think it is really important. I can create the coolest chart in the world or have like the neatest correlation between different asset classes. But if I can't explain to an end client why that matters, who cares? Right. So we think it's really, really important to sort of like demystify a lot of things that are happening in the market. And especially, for instance, like last year during the presidential election, that's a period when there's high emotional content, large volume of information, but very little of it actually matters for your portfolio. Right. So being able to like take that, redirect the conversation to like real data and things that people should be paying attention to. Again, it leads to that idea of making a good financial decision, right? So we don't want to just write 5 pages of content that nobody's ever going to read. And, I'll share too, even in how we create our portfolios, some of the things that we think are really important, like being risk aware, like being transparent, like wanting to not have a lot of unnecessary complexity. These are things that you often don't encounter with a lot of investment professionals, because they want complexity, right? They want that complexity to sort of hide behind. We want the opposite. We want people to understand why we're making certain decisions. Then they're more likely to understand and be able to focus on the long term and have better ultimate outcomes.
Rick, I'm going to throw you a little bit of a curveball here, maybe. So a lot of my colleagues were at the Ascend conference, a couple weeks back, and I've been hearing over and over about your presentation as it relates to when to take risk. And I would love if you would kind of repeat that for us.
Oh, that's hilarious. So for folks who weren't there, I always try to have like a theme when I do like my main stage presentation. And it gets back to this idea, like, I love markets and find them super interesting, but I find if I can bring in things like pop culture, people who even aren't really interested in the market get really engaged. So a couple of weeks ago, we decided to pull in Willie Nelson, right, who's a native son of Austin. The conference was here in Austin. I had a live band for the first time ever while I was speaking, which made it really fun. At a certain point, I talked about how Willie was part of like this outlaw music movement. And I shared how a number of folks who were also part of outlaw music took significant risks. So for instance, Johnny Cash got arrested for picking flowers. And he actually spent a night in jail and had to pay a fine, and eventually wrote the Starkville County Blues, I think it was called, a song about his experience. And then Chris Christopherson actually stole a helicopter, believe it or not, and landed it on Johnny Cash's front lawn and refused to leave until Johnny Cash listened to his demo tape. Remarkably, Chris Christopherson never got arrested, never got fined. He returned the helicopter. And not only that, but Johnny Cash, as pissed as he was, really liked the demo and actually recorded the song. And Chris Christopherson won Songwriter of the Year that year at the Grammys.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable.
So back to this, crazy, right? Like real life. I don't have to make anything up. But so as we think about risk taking, Johnny Cash left his hotel room that night looking for a pack of cigarettes. When he picked those flowers, he had no idea that he was actually taking risk. And he got into a whole lot of trouble. Chris Christopherson had a goal in mind, right? He wanted Johnny Cash to listen to his demo. And he took a huge risk. And I don't want to advocate that people actually do this, but he had a goal in mind, he took a risk, and it paid off, right? And that's the difference. And so when we think about portfolios, there is actually a market theme here. When we think about portfolios, we got to know the risks when we're going in. That doesn't mean we shouldn't take them, right? But we need to understand that there are risks out there, that there are unknowns, and that we need to be ready for them before they hit. And so that's a lot of what we do, is like uncovering those risks and then determining how they actually want to impact the portfolio.
Yeah. Crazy story.
That's the coolest job in the world.
Yeah, Sakira, that's it's amazing how you're able to tie those themes together. Like, how do you go about coming up with a theme like that for a presentation to provide people?
Great question.
To be honest, it's a very messy process. Oh. Yeah, I mean, my goal is usually to have something that's recognizable to a lot of people, but then also to be able to tell the story and have it be engaging enough so that if somebody walked into the room and didn't know who Willie Nelson was, and there were actually people who admitted that they didn't know who Willie Nelson was, that they can still like kind of come along for the ride, right? So it's sort of this balance between being able to tell the story and having something compelling, but also have it be recognizable to a fair number of people. And I'll give an example for this particular presentation. Originally, I wanted to do Spinal Tap. I don't know, have you guys seen that movie?
It's hilarious. Yeah.
So good. Yeah. Like such a great movie. Yeah. But then I sort of tested it out with some people, and like 15% of the people would be like, "Oh yeah, that's great," and then 85% were like, "What's Spinal Tap?" I could see that. I can't do that. Yeah. Then I was going to do Austin City Limits, which is a festival here in Austin. We love it; it's great, all sorts of bands. But Willie kept coming up during that because he's such an important part of like the festival and the program. I was like, you know what? It's got to be Willie. So at any rate, that's like part of the creative process where you can create some structure around it, but at a certain point, you just got to kind of follow where it goes.
Kara, you just mentioned that Kestra Home Office is in the Austin area, and that reminded me of something that happened the other day when we did a pre-recording for this podcast, and I got to meet with your team. And what really struck me in that 15 minutes that we got to spend together was culturally what seems to be a very supportive and really great environment to work in. Can you expand a little bit on how you approach that, and then maybe Kestra as a whole approaches that?
I mean, I concur. I've been at this firm for 4 years now, and I've just had a ball working here. And I think part of it is this like very entrepreneurial mindset where everyone's very aligned and delivering really good value, and we all back each other up, right? And we also have a lot of ownership over what we do. There's no hiding in a bureaucracy here, right? Like you're owning decisions, you're seeing things through, you're seeing what works, what doesn't, and you're relying on your colleagues to really support. And I will say, like specifically in Kestra Investment Management, again, we were a blank sheet of paper 4 years ago, and having a really strong team to kind of support the growth and the innovation that we needed to have in order to be successful was really important. And so a couple of things that we highlighted that were important as investors that then we were like, oh, these are really important as teammates too. One is having a sense of curiosity, right? I think you have to, as an investor, you got to ask questions, you got to dig in, all those charts, right? To be disciplined. We have playbooks for different market environments. We're very consistent in how we operationalize certain things. You have to have those discipline when you're in a really fast moving market. collaborative. So I think this is in particular to your question about culture. We have to be able to support each other. And I think having a lot of different ideas coming into a room and challenging each other in a really respectful way is incredibly important. As an investor, you can't get too stuck on a particular idea, right? Otherwise, you might really miss out. And then finally, one that is a little unique, I'll admit, in the investment world is this idea of humility. It's very important that we understand what we don't know, and we understand and are willing to admit when we make a mistake, and then we course correct and we learn from it going forward. And I think that is really, really important in order to keep us nimble and moving forward.
All right. That's great.
Well, yeah, that is great. It's I especially love the humility one. That's a hard one for a bunch of very smart people who come together to really have that humility, and it makes a huge difference.
Yes.
Well, Kara, this has actually been a really, really big treat for us. So thank you for taking the time to connect with us today and sharing your insight. We really appreciate it. Any last comments or thoughts?
Well, I just want to say thank you because it was so fun being able to chat with you guys. And if I could leave you with one idea, invest wisely and live richly.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, for everyone out there, hey, I'm Eric Alvarado, and this is
Ted Hikes.
Ted Hikes. All right. Hey, this has been CBS Spotlight, your friendly conversation for insurance and wealth advising come together. Thank you for tuning in. And if you found this information helpful, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you all next time. Thank you, everyone.
And give us that 5-star rating. Thanks, Kara. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kara.